and welcome to the second of the webinar series. Um, we're talking about Gen Y and are they really that different today? So my name is Cynthia Quijano and I'm the Director and Principal Consultant at Change Differently Limited. So today we are going to be talking mainly about Gen Y, and I'm going to be demystifying some of the facts around some of the perceptions and stereotypes around Gen Y. We're going to look a bit at why the possible differences actually exist and what those differences really are, and if it's true what people are saying about Gen Y and what's not true. And then I'm going to counterbalance it completely by telling you why I don't actually think Gen Y are really that different from any other generation. So before we start, I thought I'd give you a bit of background around Change Differently, as we are quite a new consultancy. I've been working in the field of organization development for over 10 years, and I've been lucky enough to work in quite a few different projects, from IT-based change to employee engagement to cultural changes in a nice multi-sector environment. So I've had the opportunity to work with really big multinationals as well as small to medium enterprises, but also with some higher education institutions. And while I was kind of working both internally and externally as a consultant, I could see that a lot of my clients weren't really thinking ahead of that 12-month mark. Everybody was kind of really focused on what changes they needed for now and didn't really have a vision of the ripple effect they could have in the organization 5 years, 10 years from now. So when I founded Change Differently, what I really wanted to do, and our purpose, is really to help organizations kind of understand and grasp that idea and really embrace building an organizational culture based on employee engagement. Basically, this is what we believe drives long-term sustainable success for organizations, and we trust that by putting people first, change can really be driven faster, better, and actually create more innovation. The other thing is, by doing it this way, we're actually still enhancing the organization's purpose and their bottom line. So that's a bit about Change Differently. And I thought we'd start with some of the basics around Gen Y. So starting from who are they? I'm a self-confessed Gen Y, so probably in the earlier stage of Gen Y, but barely making it into the generation. We're the generation right after Gen X, and they also refer to us as the millennials. So when you look at literature, there's quite a big variety of years when they say Gen Y were actually born. So we're going to go with the most common ground, which is between the 1980s and the year 2000. And that means that most Gen Yers are around 16 to 35-year-old at the minute. So it is quite a spread out generation. So from the younger spectrum, a lot of Gen Yers are still in school trying to choose what they're going to do with their lives. A lot of Gen Y are entering the workforce, and the other bit of Gen Y is probably somewhere mid-career. So it actually brings up, this is why it's been so controversial this last few years, and people trying to really understand what Gen Y is really about, because we are becoming a larger percentage of the population at the workplace. So I thought I'd bore you with a couple of stats and actually help you understand why we say that it's a growing population. So I'm starting with the UK because that's where I'm based. And unfortunately, there's not tons of demographic information that we can really narrow it down. But if you look at the little blue ones, we're really saying that the majority of the population kind of fall when you mix Gen Y and Gen X together. The UK, very much like a lot of the European counterparts, have quite a big baby boomer generation still, and quite big in the workplace. And this actually starts kind of giving us an idea of why there are so many issues and conflicts when people start talking about the three generations sharing a workplace. But it's not just in the UK, it's kind of worldwide as well. So across the globe, we have kind of a very similar picture. And there's actually not too many studies around Gen Y, even though it's becoming a very fashionable subject. And actually the US seem to have most of the actual research around Gen Y. But according to Wikipedia, the US millennials in 2015 are 83.1 million. And it's predicted that this year, so 2016, it's going to be the year the Gen Y actually increases and is a larger population than the baby boomers in their side. So they'll be the largest living population in the US. And actually, it's not very hard to see. we have this nice little graph provided by Nielsen that actually has the breakdown from 2014 from all the generations. And we see that actually the baby boomers and millennials last year were at that same percentage, 24. And we can see that actually Gen X is quite a small proportion of the generations. And this also starts giving us a bit of an indication that they might be feeling like the sandwich generation. And it's probably very, very, very true because a lot of Gen X are probably managing Gen Ys, and we'll go on to that in a bit. So how about the rest of the world? Well, in the whole of Europe, millennials account for about 24% of the population. And actually, interestingly enough, Germany has the most number of millennials of the whole European Union, with 14.68 million. But very much like the UK, they are very much facing an aging population with a big, big percentage of their population being in the baby boomers. Latin America has 157 million millennials, which actually represents about 26% of their population. And I just took Brazil, for example, trying to dig through some demographics. And in approximation, when you add some of these numbers up, you have that they have about 50 million Gen Yers. Australia have obviously a bit less. They're a bit smaller country, but they still have 4.9 million millennials in their stats. And Japan, looking at that Asian market, has 18.8. So it's actually really important now that we've seen what a large demographic they are to actually understand what people are saying about Gen Y and what if it is true, what if it's not, and what can we do to start bridging some of the gaps. And like I said, I'll counter my argument later by saying that we're actually not that different. So I don't know if anybody remembers Gen X. When Gen X started growing up, they had really cool adverts. Everybody was talking about Generation Next, Generation X, and it was all very exciting. But actually, Gen Y have faced something a bit less exciting. A lot of people keep asking, well, we don't really understand them. They're coming into the workplace. They're being really disruptive. And actually, a lot of the adjectives they use to describe my generation are actually not as positive. They've described us as lazy, entitled, disloyal, self-centered, arrogant, difficult to manage, attached to our phones, and therefore very unsociable and with low people skills. Now I'm going to demystify a lot of these, even though some of them might have a bit of truth behind them. Because I don't know about you, but if your generation was described the same way, you'd probably try to find a way to actually counterbalance the argument. But before we go into demystifying what is true and what is not, I thought it'd also be very important to understand why these differences actually exist. And actually, this will start telling us why they actually exist, because there's a lot of mega trends that Gen Y got into. So the actual workplace has been massively changing. It definitely does not look the same as when my parents or my grandparents went and started working. We've had a market crash over the last few years and about a couple of recessions already in place. This has meant that things like a job for life no longer exist. And with this, we had the 3 generations sharing a workplace. Now in the UK, I'm not sure about other geographies, but here in the UK, we no longer have a retirement age, which means that because of the economy crash and because of the financial crisis, a lot of baby boomers are actually staying at work longer, which means there's probably not that much career progression for a Gen X, and therefore even less job opportunities for Gen Y. So there's this job saturation market that we're starting to live in. And this is the job market Gen Ys are going into. So I'm just going to take you back a couple of years, and then before I kind of reveal the 4th one, when the baby boomers went to work. So right after the war, they thought, well, actually, work and life was very different things. Work was a means to have a life, and they did actually look for a career for life. And because it separated work and life, leadership was seen as something completely different. It was mainly around status and knowledge. And the way you got leadership positions back then was definitely 3 years of experience and working your way up the ranks. Also, this made it very respectful for people that reached those positions. For Gen X, they started facing some of the recession. So we have some of the first households with two incomes. And actually, this is the part where nowadays Gen X are actually finding it a lot harder to kind of balance work and life, because they did kind of inherit that work and life may not always mix, heritage that the baby boomers inherited. So they are actually starting to fight for things like workplace flexibility. That's something that Gen Y just demands. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But also Gen X, because they've inherited this, actually still kind of value the hard work and the more typical career progression. And this is where Gen X and Gen Y tend to have a bit of friction, because Gen Y just don't work like that. For Gen Y, they consciously are very conscious about the fact that there's no more career for life. And actually, more than a quarter of Gen Y expect to have at least 7 different employers in their career. Also with Gen Y, they're not expecting just to have one job. Gen Y are actually looking into having multiple income streams that can actually balance their financial status. And also for Gen Y, work has stopped becoming a means to an end. So they don't necessarily want a job. What they want is something that really blends in nicely to their life. So they'll be looking for things that are actually very integrated to themselves. And so they're looking for that integration, being able to be themselves at work. And actually, they don't believe in typical career progression, and they believe in meritocracy 100%. So we can start seeing where some of these clashes are happening. But obviously, a big driver of change with Gen Y is also technology. And technology has blurred geographical boundaries, office space boundaries. It's really made everything a lot more seamless. And actually, it's really changed our personal life. So obviously, Gen Y think this is an immediate change in work life as well. And I don't know about you, but I certainly only had a mobile phone when I was about 18. And that was probably so my mom could have keep tabs on me. But Gen Y, we have grown up with technology changing really rapidly, and we've had to go through all those changes. So what's actually true about Gen Y is that we are a catalyst for change. Mainly because all these work trends happened while we were studying and getting into work. It meant that a lot of organizations have had to kind of relook at themselves and try to adapt to a new way of working. The reality is that we do have different work expectations. So it is 60% of Gen Y are actually looking for interesting work rather than salary. Like we said, they're looking for something beyond the job, something that actually matches their personal lives as well. We talked about digitalization and being tech savvy. This is one of the best traits about Gen Y, because we have grown up from when a cell phone or a mobile phone was a big thing that looked like a brick to a smartphone. We have been able to adapt quickly to changes and learn really fast. So something really nice about Gen Y is that they're very adaptable and can learn fast. And this actually makes them actually probably become slightly entitled in the fact that they feel that they need more opportunities and more challenges quicker. What is also true about Gen Y is they do think about themselves first. So this for many people comes out as self-centered, but I wouldn't really necessarily call it that. It's just putting themselves first rather than the organization. This means they kind of value being treated as individuals at the workplace. However, it's still very true that Gen Y loves collaborative working. So 88% of Gen Y actually love working in a collaborative environment more than in a competitive environment. We're also quite demanding in the sense that we do believe that we deserve to be in that meritocracy, and we'll expect our employees to actually reward and recognize that effort. And the same with career progression. And if we're not feeling that we're being valued or recognized, we know because there's no career for life, we can just go find somewhere that will. So that's where a lot of these things around maybe feeling disloyal come into play, because we do look at our own needs first. But there are different ways to retain Gen Y staff. This part has to do a lot with flexibility. We are a lot more goal orientated. So if people do give us the autonomy to work and actually just focus maybe on goals and being able to get the job done, we will do it. It's just in a different way and our own hours, probably not the typical hours Gen X and baby boomers are accustomed to. And also in regards to actually retaining, it was actually really interesting because what's been actually published is by Ashridge said that actually they're more likely to stick around if people feel they're really proud at work. But also 73 really are personally motivated by actually creating organizational success and helping the organizations reach that. And 80% are motivated to go that extra mile if needed. So it's actually not a bad thing. It's just actually creating that environment where Gen Y will want to give a bit more of themselves at work. So what's not true? We're not lazy, we're not unsociable, we're not difficult to manage, and we're not entitled, even though I said we can come out like that once in a while. Even though Gen Y do work in unconventional ways, they rather work in unconventional hours than be stuck in the 9-to-5 rigidity. So again, this has really been made possible through mobile working, and the idea of being able to mix their personal responsibilities with their work responsibilities. They like managing their own workload, and 74% have talked about wanting this flexibility at work, and 88% want work-life integration. So you'll notice I didn't say work-life balance, because like we said, it's not necessarily that they're looking for work and life to balance each other out, but it's very much something that goes together. They don't believe that if you spend 8 hours at work, it should be completely different to what you want in life. So that's the main thing with Gen Y. A lot of people say us as unsociable, and like I said, sometimes they think we're attached to our phones and just have it like an integral part of our hand. But it's just the fact that Gen Y are creating connections through other means. Social media being obviously the big one here. And it's actually to build connections and friendships this way in their personal life. And I think Gen Y, what happens is that you then expect the same at work, to have kind of the same tools. There's been quite a lot of studies and a lot of research done around social media and Gen Y. Some point out that still Gen Y probably still find social media slightly distracting. And other studies mention that Gen Y actually find it as a really useful tool. But what I found really interesting is that probably it is quite useful tool because it allows that flexibility for when they're on the move. If you're thinking about bigger companies, they're probably needing to travel, so it gives them that immediacy of communication. But also it makes us try to understand that actually to attract Gen Y, social media is actually a must. It was really interesting because I was reading an article and I actually published a study by Cisco saying that 56% of students would not even consider a position in an organization that bans social media. So it's definitely a no-no if you want to retain your Gen Y staff, and it's actually more about integrating it into your normal communication channels. But regardless of what a lot of people think, actually the number one tool for Gen Y is still face-to-face. It's about building that relationship beyond work as well. So face-to-face is still number one. So if you do have a big message to give as a leader, that's still probably the best way to go. Difficult to manage. Now, because of the way Gen Y have actually grown up, and we talked about the market crash, and if you think about a lot of the stuff that happened around the market crash, we had a lot of organizations being really hot on the press as being really inauthentic, leaders actually being slightly corrupt, and actually just this attention in the press has made it really, really hard for Gen Y to go into the workplace really trusting people. So what's actually happened is that Gen Y don't believe leaders should just have the respect due to their title, but leaders must earn your respect and trust. So it's a completely different paradigm shift if you think about what we said about the baby boomers and Gen X before, that it's more about experience. And actually now for Gen Y, because of the technology, it's actually really easy for them to research a lot of things around the organizations they're planning to work for, around the leaders they plan to work for. I'm sure we've all heard about Glassdoor by now, and if not, I suggest you do Google it. But it's a really good way to actually just go in, have a look, and then people can decide for themselves. And then a lot more Gen Y are actually starting to do that. But also, if you start thinking about what Gen Y want in leaders, they want to be able to connect to their managers in a different way. They want to be able to actually have a relationship with them. So it's not just feedback about how well they're doing or the recognition about their effort. It's having that space to talk not just about their work life, but also their personal life. And to be honest, in a lot of the research, we're looking at really high percentages of Gen Y saying they want to be their own boss. But if we start looking at some of the mega trends we talked about earlier, it's maybe because they have no other option, so they're having to build their own companies, or because it's the only way they see that they can have that flexibility they're looking for. But what it has been said in a lot of research is that when Gen Y actually have a boss or a leader, what they want them to be is more like a coach and a mentor, and actually, like I said, talk not just about work, but also about life. So in title, we're going to go back to the meritocracy argument. So Gen Y are a bit more vocal, that is very true, around fairness and transparency in the workplace. Again, probably has to do with the fact that when the market crashed, a lot of these stories were hot on the press. And actually, when we have organizations that are so flat, because that's what happened in the recession, a lot of organizations downsized and created really, really flat structures. It's not that Gen Y feel entitled and want to go up really fast in the workplace, but what they want to see is that there's actual opportunities. So what happens is a lot of time people do think we're entitled or want to go too fast, but Gen Y maybe are just seeing the things quite realistically, that right now the job market is dead man's shoes. So it's actually just making sure that there are some opportunities, and if they're not, that they are getting developed in such a way that they can actually build skills. So the also thing with a career progression is they want to make sure that if there is an opportunity, it's more fair and equitable, and it's not just based in years of experience, that it's actually based more on skills. A lot of people can call that quite optimistic. I think it's quite debatable. So now for the bit where I'm going to just contradict everything I just said and actually tell you why we're not actually that different. When we start looking a bit more into Gen Y and actually what they really want out of work, I personally don't believe we're that much different from what Gen X and the baby boomers want from work. So if we look at a lot of the literature and a lot of what people are saying anecdotally as well as in a lot of the studies, is that Gen Y want a place of work that has purpose. They want to fulfill their own purpose, and they want an organization that has a clear purpose of where they're going. Because they really do want to make a difference in the world, they are looking for meaningful work. And that could be in potentially anything, but as long as they feel they're making a meaningful contribution to the organization. So these two kind of go very nicely hand in hand. So if we think about that, I want you to think about yourself and think about what you would want for anybody else. I'm sure we would all agree that we want to work in a place that has a great purpose and that actually work gives us a bit of a meaning to ourselves. So that's one of the reasons I don't actually think we're that different. The other bit is around flexible working. So Gen Y actually demand flexible working, so they want to work with a completely different paradigm if possible. Maybe working in a collaborative office, maybe working in a coffee shop, actually being able to fit that kind of personal life and work life together. But actually, as we said, Gen X are actually asking for this very same thing, maybe for different reasons, because they're having to take care of children as well as elderly parents, and these caring responsibilities are taking over, but they're still looking for flexible working. Authentic leadership. I think since the market crash, every single generation, not just Gen Y, want this. They're looking for leaders they can trust and leaders who have this purpose and vision behind them. Feedback and recognition. It's something Gen Y strive for. They really want to be recognized for the effort they're putting in, because it's a way to telling them that they're actually making that meaningful contribution and making a difference. But to be honest, I don't necessarily think it's something that Gen Y just wants. I'm sure almost all human beings would like a bit of recognition for the efforts they're putting in. And trust. A lot is said about Gen Y wanting autonomy at work, but when it really comes down to it, what they want to feel is that they're trusted to do the work. So this is something that I believe is actually quite universal for most individuals at work. They want to feel like they're trusted to make decisions, either whether it's in their role or that they can actually contribute to bigger decisions at work. So these are the things I think completely change kind of some of the paradigms coming in from what people think Gen Y actually really wants something really completely different. It's not in the basics and in the core of it, it's exactly the same. But just in case, I thought I'd give you a couple of hints and tips about engaging with Gen Y and bridging some of those generational misunderstandings. So reverse mentoring or buddying programs are amazing for these things because what you do is you can buddy up a Gen Y with a baby boomer or with a Gen X, and they can kind of start sharing experiences. And this is great because it allows Gen Y to have a bit more of that knowledge and skills that maybe the Gen X baby boomers have, but it also allows baby boomers and Gen X to kind of understand different work approaches and different work processes that Gen Y might be more familiar with. So it gives this really nice circular learning with both of the generations. So training and development. So because Gen Y are so fixed in career progression, sometimes we forget that not everybody wants to be a director or a head of department. And I think this is the same case for Gen Y. It's not so much if they have a career progression ladder, it's more about are they being trained and developed for more challenges at work. And this is really great because with Gen Y, my recommendation is actually to talk to them individually because they probably want a bit more of an individual program rather than maybe an off-the-shelf one. Having a clear strategic narrative, and this is one I would recommend for anyone anyway, but it's making sure that as leaders, you really have that purpose and that vision trickle down the whole organization, that everybody knows what they're there for and what they're striving for. And for Gen Y, obviously, that is even more important because it's something they're really, really passionate about. A wide variety of communication channels for all generations and for a lot of individual preferences. Because at the end of the day, these are all stereotypes. Obviously, all Gen Yers are very different between themselves. And I actually know quite a lot of Gen X colleagues that are a lot better at technology than I am, so it all works out nicely. My best advice for communication, especially in times of change, is if you have an important message, make sure you send it via 2 channels at least. Very good point, David. I'll come to your point just towards the end. So wide variety of communications that fits everybody is probably a nice way to go. And I think a good thing is actually if we look back at one of the earlier slides and think about why these changes actually occurred, it's actually supporting the baby boomers and Gen X to understand why Gen Y are coming from such a different perspective. So it's actually getting them to understand some of that contextual work around what the workplace used to be like and what the workplace is now, and actually getting them to understand that this is part of the paradigm shift that we've been living in. And obviously transparency in decision making, which again is one I would recommend anyway. But it is quite interesting to actually look at fairness and equitability at the workplace because it actually makes it a lot easier for Gen Y to understand why things are happening that way. So it's very good, and it's, like I said, one I would actually recommend to anyone anyway. And just before I leave, because actually this is a very nice debatable point, David's just written on the chat, I don't know if everybody can see that, but it just says, what strikes me is that Gen Y and Gen Z seek recognition more than earlier generations. They think differently, outwardly confident, but often when it comes to it, inwardly insecure. That's probably very correct. There is a reason why social media is so good for Gen Y and Gen Z. It's because it doesn't really matter what personality type you are, whether you're an extrovert and an introvert, you can create really good relationship and build connections doing it that way. And yes, we do seek recognition, and that is mainly to do with the fact that we actually want our efforts to be recognized. It has to do with the fact that we are more demanding and we do want to make sure we're making that contribution. So kind of making sure we know that we're actually making a difference at the workplace. Because if nobody tells us or nobody rewards us, we might just think that we're just doing a job and not actually getting anything out of it. So again, it kind of comes back to looking for a purpose at work. So that's all. I'm going to open the line after I stop recording just so we can have a bit of a debate because, again, this is all just a bit of thinking. Um, but it is the first webinar of the year. The next one we have is in February the 18th, and it's all about actually engaging with employee engagement within organizational strategy. And there's many ways that you can connect with me. So if you don't want to stay and have a bit of debate, you can go and just connect with me during the website. I have a Twitter account. You can connect to us on LinkedIn. And if you really, really like us and you want to support a crowdfunding campaign, you can also do so by just going to Indiegogo and looking for Change Differently. Like I said, I'm just going to stop recording and then open the line so we can have a really nice debate. But how do you do this?